picture yourself waking before dawn in a cramped cottage that reeks of smoke, damp straw, and the livestock sharing your single room. Your hands are already calloused and cracked from yesterday's labor. Your back aches from bending over furrows in the Lord's fields, and you know that today will bring more of the same, back-breaking work. You own almost nothing. The land you till belongs to another. Your children will inherit your status, bound to this same earth. This same endless cycle of toil. You cannot leave without permission. You cannot marry without paying a fee. Even in death, your family must surrender your best animal to the Lord as payment. This was the reality for millions across medieval England. The serfs, who formed the foundation of an entire civilization, yet lived lives of profound restriction and relentless labor. But here's what might surprise you about their world. It wasn't quite the hopeless existence we often imagine. The story of the medieval serf is more complex, more nuanced, and in some ways more hopeful than the simple tale of oppression we've been told. Understanding what life was truly like for these people requires us to step into their world, to see through their eyes, to feel the texture of their daily existence, in all its difficulty and occasional joy. To understand the serf's life, we must first grasp what serfdom actually meant in medieval England. Serfs, sometimes called villains, were not slaves in the ancient or American sense. They could not be bought or sold as individuals, separated from their families, or traded like livestock. This distinction mattered immensely. What bound them was not ownership of their person, but attachment to the land itself. They were, in legal terms, unfree laborers who worked a lord's estate in exchange for protection, justice, and the right to cultivate strips of land for their own survival. The relationship was hereditary and perpetual. Children born to serf parents inherited their status automatically, entering the world already obligated to the lord of the manor. This created generations of families whose destinies were intertwined with particular plots of earth, particular villages, particular masters. The origins of this system stretched back to the collapse of the Roman Empire, when centralized authority crumbled and local strongmen offered protection to vulnerable populations in exchange for labor and loyalty. As Viking raids terrorized England's coasts and countryside during the 9th and 10th centuries, many free farmers voluntarily submitted to powerful lords, trading their independence for security. The Norman conquest of 1066 formalized and expanded these arrangements. By the time of the Domesday Book in 1087, approximately 35% of England's population were serfs or villains, with another 30% existing as cotters and boarders, even lower on the social hierarchy. But not all serfs were equal. Villains were the most common type, holding between 20 and 30 acres of land in scattered strips throughout the manor's fields. They owed their lord substantial labor service, typically working his domain, his personal farmland, for 3 days each week. Half-villains held about half that acreage and often struggled to make ends meet, forced to hire themselves out to more prosperous neighbors. Cotters and boarders occupied the lowest rungs, with tiny holdings of 1 to 5 acres, barely enough to sustain a family. They owned no draft animals, no oxen or horses to pull plows, and survived by working for villains, or directly for the lord in exchange for food. This stratification created a hierarchy even among the unfree, with some serf families living in relative comfort, while others scraped by in desperate poverty. The manor was the center of the serf's universe, the organizing principle of medieval rural life. These agricultural estates varied enormously in size, from a few hundred acres to thousands, encompassing multiple villages, woodlands, meadows, mills, and the lord's residence itself. whether a fortified castle or a more modest manor house. Everything revolved around this hub. The manor's fields were typically divided into 3 great open sections under a rotation system. One section grew wheat or rye, another grew barley or oats, and the third lay fallow to recover its fertility. Each villain held strips in all 3 sections, scattered throughout the manor rather than consolidated. This dispersal seemed inefficient, but actually served important purposes, ensuring that everyone shared equally in good and poor soil, in fields near the village and those farther away. Work dominated the serf's existence, structured by both the agricultural calendar and the lord's demands. A villain's obligations fell into several categories. Week work required them to labor on the lord's domain for a set number of days each week, typically 3, though this varied by region and custom. During these days, they plowed, harrowed, sowed, weeded, and performed whatever tasks the lord's bailiff commanded. The bailiff, usually a more prosperous peasant or sometimes a minor gentleman, supervised the workforce, assigned daily tasks, and ensured quotas were met. Then came boom work, special additional labor demanded at critical times, especially during harvest when every hand was needed to bring in grain before weather could destroy it. Serfs were expected to drop their own work and report to the domain fields with their entire household. The urgency was real. A delayed harvest could mean ruin for everyone. But what did a typical day actually look like? Let's follow a villain named Thomas through an ordinary summer day. He rises before dawn, perhaps around 4 in the morning, when faint light begins to seep through the shuttered window opening of his cottage. His wife Margaret is already awake, stirring the embers of their hearth fire and setting a pot of pottage, a thick grain porridge, to warm. Thomas drinks some weak ale, the standard breakfast beverage, since water was often unsafe, and eats a hunk of dark bread. By the time the sun clears the horizon, he's walking toward the Lord's fields, a mile from the village, carrying tools. The work is physically demanding. Scything hay requires a constant rhythmic motion that strains the back and shoulders. Plowing behind an ox team means walking miles behind the animals, controlling the plow's blade through heavy soil. Threshing grain after harvest involves beating sheaves with a flail, hour after hour, in choking dust. A pace was somewhat leisurely by modern industrial standards, with breaks for rest and drink, and the workday often ended by early afternoon during the summer months when heat became oppressive. But make no mistake, this was exhausting labor that left bodies worn by middle age. Thomas returns home in the afternoon, but his day isn't finished. Now he must work his own strips, the land that actually feeds his family. He has roughly 24 acres scattered across the manor's 3 fields. An acre was defined as the amount one man with 1 ox could plow in a single day. The scattered nature of his holdings means walking between distant strips, wasting time and energy. He might spend the late afternoon and evening hoeing weeds from his growing. When darkness falls and work becomes impossible, only then does the family truly rest. Women's labor was equally essential and equally relentless. While Thomas worked the fields, Margaret managed the household's domestic production. She milked the family's cow, made butter and cheese, tended their small vegetable garden, cared for chickens and geese, collected eggs, spun wool or flax into thread, wove cloth, sewed and mended clothing, cooked meals, cleaned the cottage, and raised children. She brewed ale, a complex process requiring careful attention, because ale was the household's primary beverage, and a woman's brewing skill directly affected her family's quality of life. During harvest, Margaret joined Thomas in the fields, leaving their smallest children in the care of older siblings or elderly relatives. The medieval household operated as a complete economic unit in which every member contributed to survival. The physical reality of a serf's home tells us much about their standard of living. The typical cottage was a modest structure built from whatever materials the land provided and requiring minimal expense. In many regions of England, the framework consisted of wooden posts driven into the ground and connected by horizontal beams. The walls between these structural elements were filled with wattle and daub, a construction method involving woven sticks, wattle, plastered with a mixture of clay, mud, straw, and animal dung, the daub. This dried into a surprisingly durable wall, though it required regular maintenance and could become damp in wet seasons. The roof was thatched with straw or reeds, bundled and layered to shed rain, though it needed replacement every few decades and was vulnerable to fire. Most serf cottages contained only one room, perhaps 15 feet by 20 feet, though more prosperous villas might have a second chamber or a separate stable structure. The single room served all purposes: sleeping, eating, working, and living. In the center stood a hearth, simply a designated spot on the earthen floor where fire burned continuously. There was no chimney. Smoke rose to the rafters and eventually found its way out through gaps in the thatch and through a hole in the roof. This constant smoke had the advantage of preserving the roof thatch and deterring insects, but it also filled the room with an acrid haze that irritated eyes and lungs. Imagine trying to sleep in that environment, breathing smoke all night, your clothing and hair perpetually smelling of wood fire. The furnishings were sparse and functional. Beds might be simple wooden frames with rope or leather strapping, topped with mattresses stuffed with straw or heather. More commonly, serfs slept on straw pallets laid directly on the floor, covered with rough woolen blankets. Sleeping arrangements were communal, with children sharing sleeping spaces and retired grandparents occupying a corner of the room. A few wooden chests stored clothing and valuables. There might be a rough table, some stools or benches, clay or wooden bowls and cups, a few iron cooking pots hanging near the hearth, and tools leaning in corners. Lighting came from the hearth fire and perhaps tallow candles made from animal fat, though these were expensive enough that most activities had to occur during daylight hours. Surviving tax assessments give us glimpses of what an average serf household owned. One record from 1304 lists the possessions of Richard Bovechurch, a villain from Cuxham: 3 draft animals valued at 10 shillings, a cart worth 3 shillings, a harrow worth 12 pence, a plow with metal blade worth 3 shillings, various other agricultural tools, cooking equipment, and grain stores. His total movable wealth was valued at around 30 shillings. This might not sound like much, and it wasn't, but it represented years of accumulated savings and represented security. Those draft animals were critical capital, enabling him to plow his land efficiently. Their loss would be catastrophic. The cottage stood within a small enclosed yard or toft that served multiple purposes. Here the family kept their livestock, a cow or two, a pig fattening for winter slaughter, chickens scratching for insects, perhaps geese. The animals were valuable assets, but also daily responsibilities requiring feeding and care. A small vegetable garden occupied another section of the yard, where Margaret grew cabbages, onions, garlic, leeks, peas, beans, and herbs for cooking and medicine. This garden supplemented the grain-heavy diet with essential nutrients and flavors. The yard also contained a midden heap, where household waste and animal manure accumulated for eventual use as fertilizer on the fields. Surrounding the village was a complex agricultural landscape. Beyond the great open fields lay common meadows where villagers had rights to graze livestock after the hay harvest. Woodlands, often carefully managed by the lord, provided timber for construction and repair, firewood for heating and cooking, and forage for pigs, which were turned out to feed on acorns and beech nuts in autumn. Serfs had limited and regulated access to these woods. They could collect fallen deadwood, but couldn't cut living trees without permission. Hunting game was strictly forbidden to all but the nobility, a restriction that caused considerable resentment since deer, boar, and rabbits damaged crops with impunity, while hungry villagers watched. What did serfs actually eat? The medieval diet was dramatically different from ours, shaped by necessity, season, and the limitations of preservation technology. Grain dominated everything. Bread, in various forms, provided the bulk of calories. The quality varied by what grain was available. Wheat made the finest white bread, but that was typically reserved for the lord's table or sold for cash. Serfs ate coarser bread made from barley, rye, or mixed grains. This dark bread was dense, heavy, and filling. A family might consume several pounds of bread per day. The phrase daily bread in the Lord's Prayer reflected this absolute centrality of bread to survival. Alongside bread came pottage, the universal peasant meal. Pottage was essentially a thick stew or porridge made by boiling grain, usually oats or barley, in water until it achieved a consistency someway between soup and porridge. Into this base went whatever else was available: peas, beans, onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, and herbs. On fortunate days, a bit of bacon or salt pork might flavor the pot. The result was monotonous but nutritious, providing protein from legumes and whatever vitamins the vegetables retained after prolonged boiling. Pottage simmered continuously in a pot hanging over the hearth, with ingredients added as they became available and portions ladled out at mealtimes. Meat was rare in the serf's diet, at least fresh meat. In 13th century England, meat contributed almost no calories to a typical harvest worker's diet. This changed somewhat after the Black Death decimated populations and made meat more available. But even then, it remained a luxury. Pork was the most common meat when available, since pigs were efficient converters of waste and forage into protein. A family might raise a pig through the summer and autumn, fattening it on kitchen scraps and acorns, then slaughter it in early winter. The meat would be salted, smoked, or otherwise preserved to last through the cold months. Bacon and salt pork, cut into small pieces, served mainly as flavoring agents rather than main dishes. Chicken was another potential meat source, though laying hens were too valuable to slaughter casually. Old hens past their laying prime might end up in a pot, creating a tough but flavorful stew. Eggs were treasured both for eating and for the income they generated when sold at market. Fish provided an important protein source, especially on fast days when the church prohibited meat consumption. But access to fish varied dramatically by location. Those living near rivers or coasts could catch freshwater fish like pike, perch, and eel, or ocean fish like herring and cod. Inland serfs relied on fish ponds or had to purchase preserved fish, often heavily salted herring, when they could afford it. Dairy products played an important role. Cow's milk was consumed fresh when available, but more often was processed into cheese or butter, which kept longer. Cheese was a valuable source of protein and fat. Medieval cheese was quite different from modern varieties, generally harder, saltier, and stronger in flavor. Butter, once made, could be preserved in brine or kept cool in cellars. Sheep and goats also provided milk and cheese, particularly in regions where cattle were less common. Vegetables from the garden supplemented the grain-based diet. Cabbages, onions, leeks, and garlic appeared frequently. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips stored well through winter in cool cellars or outdoor pits. Peas and beans, both fresh in summer and dried for winter use, were dietary staples, providing much-needed protein when meat was unavailable. Medieval medical theory viewed beans with some suspicion, associating them with flatulence and crude peasant fare, but practical necessity made them indispensable. Fruit was seasonal and largely consumed fresh or dried. Apples, pears, plums, and cherries grew in orchards when trees were available. Berries could be gathered from hedgerows and woods. Blackberries, strawberries, raspberries. These provided welcome variety and sweetness in a diet otherwise lacking in sugar. Honey was the only sweetener available, expensive and usually reserved for the wealthy. For beverages, water was drunk when nothing else was available, but it was viewed with suspicion, rightly so, given medieval sanitation. Ale was the universal drink, consumed by everyone, including children, though the ale drunk by ordinary people was weaker than what we recognize today, around 2 to 3% alcohol. It was safer than water because the brewing process involved boiling and it provided calories and some nutrition. Women brewed ale regularly, usually once a week or so, since it didn't keep long. Wine was far too expensive for most serfs, reserved for the wealthy and used in church rituals. The meal pattern differed from our modern 3 meals. Most people ate twice daily, a substantial dinner around midday and a lighter supper in the evening. Breakfast was not a formal meal but might consist of leftover bread and ale before starting work. The midday dinner, eaten after the morning's labor, was the main meal, featuring pottage, bread, and whatever else was available. Supper was simpler, perhaps more bread with cheese or leftover pottage. Feast days provided rare opportunities for better food. Christmas, Easter, and other major religious holidays brought special meals, and the Lord traditionally invited his serfs to feast at his hall on Christmas Day. These occasions meant meat, plenty of ale, and a temporary escape from the grinding monotony of daily sustenance. But even then, serfs often had to provide the food themselves from their own stores, so the generosity was somewhat limited. The financial and labor obligations weighing on serfs were extensive and relentless, eating away at whatever prosperity they might otherwise achieve. Understanding these burdens reveals why serfs remained trapped in poverty despite their constant labor. Week work and boon work we've already discussed, but they were only the beginning. On top of labor services, serfs owed various payments in kind and increasingly in coin. The tithe was perhaps the most significant, required by the church. It amounted to 10% of everything a serf produced: grain, vegetables, eggs, lambs, everything. This went to support the local priest, maintain the church building, and provide a modest welfare fund for the desperately poor. The tithe was collected rigorously and represented an enormous drain on resources. Imagine working all year and seeing 1/10 of your harvest carted away. For a family barely producing enough to survive, that 10% could mean the difference between adequacy and hunger. Beyond the tithe came manorial dues. Serfs typically owed a portion of their harvest directly to the Lord, perhaps another 10 to 20%, depending on local custom. This might be paid in grain, in livestock, or increasingly, as the medieval period progressed, in money. The shift toward money payments, called commutation, became more common in the 14th and 15th centuries and had complex effects. It gave serfs more flexibility, allowing them to sell their surplus and pay a fixed cash amount rather than providing labor service. But it also exposed them to market fluctuations and the need to generate cash income. Then came the endless fees for life events and privileges. When a serf's daughter married someone from outside the manor, the family owed a merchet fine to compensate the lord for losing her labor. This could be several shillings, a substantial sum. When a serf died, his heir owed a heriot, a feudal relief payment often taking the form of the family's best animal, their most valuable movable asset. Imagine losing your husband and then being forced to surrender your best ox or cow to the Lord just to keep your land. For widows and orphaned families, this could be devastating. Marriage itself required the Lord's permission. Serfs couldn't simply marry whom they chose. If a villain wanted to wed, he had to seek the Lord's consent and often pay a fee for the privilege. This wasn't mere tyranny. From the Lord's perspective, marriage could result in a serf leaving the manor if she married someone from another estate, causing a loss of labor. The Lord had an economic interest in controlling such movements. But from the serf's perspective, it meant that even the most personal decisions required permission and payment. Access to the Lord's mill, oven, and winepress required additional fees. Serfs were typically compelled to use the Lord's facilities rather than their own, ensuring the Lord captured these fees. You couldn't grind your grain at home. You had to take it to the manorial mill and pay a portion as the miller's fee. You couldn't bake bread in your cottage. You had to use the Lord's oven and pay for the privilege. These monopolies generated significant revenue for the Lord while limiting serfs' independence. Restrictions on movement meant that if a serf wanted to travel beyond the manor, even to visit relatives or go on a pilgrimage, he needed permission and often had to pay a license fee. The traditional story held that if a serf could escape to a town and remain there for a year and a day, he gained his freedom. This legal principle existed, but it was rarely honored in practice. Lords sent agents to track down fugitive serfs and drag them back, using the manorial court to enforce their claims. The manorial court itself was another source of revenue, presided over by the lord or his steward. This court handled disputes between tenants, punished minor infractions, and enforced the lord's rights. Serfs were required to attend court sessions, held several times yearly, or pay a fine for absence. Everything that came before the court generated fees, registering land transactions, resolving disputes over boundaries or debts, reporting crimes. Everything. The court functioned as much as a revenue source as a justice system. Despite the hardships, serfs created families, raised children, and built communities. The human need for connection and belonging persisted even in difficult circumstances. Marriage among serfs was both practical and personal. Young people generally married in their late teens or early 20s, somewhat later than the stereotype of early medieval marriage suggests. Women typically wed around 18 to 20, men a few years older. This relatively late marriage age helped control family size and population growth, though it varied by region and period. Courtship happened within the confines of village life. Young people knew each other from childhood, working together in fields, attending church together, celebrating festivals together. Romance certainly existed, but practical considerations mattered too. A villain's son needed to find a bride who brought land to the marriage, or whose family could contribute to establishing a new household. Marriages were often strategic alliances between families. Attempts to consolidate holdings or forge useful connections. Parents had significant influence over their children's choices, though outright forced marriages were less common than sometimes imagined. The marriage ceremony followed church requirements. Bans were announced on 3 successive Sundays, allowing anyone who knew a reason the marriage should not occur to object. The ceremony took place at the church door, publicly, with the exchange of vows and a ring. Afterward, the couple and their families proceeded inside for a mass, then returned home or to the Lord's Hall for a celebration if they could afford one. The festivities were modest by noble standards, but important to the couple and community, featuring food, ale, dancing, and music. Married life meant establishing a household, ideally with its own cottage and land. Often young couples lived initially with the husband's parents, waiting for the older generation to die or retire before taking over the holding fully. When a serf died, his land passed to his heir, usually the eldest son, though customs varied. Younger sons faced difficult prospects. No land, no clear means of support. Some remained as laborers on their brother's holding. Others hired themselves out as servants or workers. Some left for towns, seeking opportunities. Children arrived regularly. Medieval families tended to be large by modern standards, with 5 to 8 children not uncommon. But mortality was horrific. Roughly 15 to 20% of children died in their first year. Another 10 to 15% died before age 5. Only about half of all children born survived to adulthood. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, and the general harshness of life took a terrible toll. Parents faced the grief of losing children repeatedly, a pain that must have been almost unbearable, yet was so common as to be expected. Children who survived began contributing to the household economy early. By age 5 or 6, they were old enough to scare birds from crops, gather eggs, watch younger siblings. By 7 or 8, boys worked alongside their fathers in the fields, learning agricultural skills. Girls helped their mothers with all the domestic tasks. At age 12, children were enrolled in tithings, the local security groups, and were considered capable of committing crimes and being punished as adults. Formal education was rare, limited to perhaps 5% of the population. Most lords actively discouraged educating serfs, viewing literacy as unnecessary and potentially dangerous. An educated peasant might question his situation or seek opportunities beyond agricultural labor. Community bonds were essential. The village was everything: workplace, social center, religious community. Everyone knew everyone else, knew their families, their histories, their business. This created both support and suffocating lack of privacy. Neighbors helped each other during crises, bringing in a sick man's harvest, caring for orphans, pooling resources during famine. But it also meant that gossip spread rapidly, that petty feuds could last generations, that any deviation from norms brought instant community judgment. Serfs had minimal legal rights, vulnerable to the lord's justice with little recourse. The manorial court, held several times yearly in the lord's hall, was the primary legal forum for serfs. Presided over by the lord, or more commonly his steward, with a jury of 12 local men, this court handled virtually everything: land transfers, debt disputes, petty theft, assault, violations of manorial customs. All adult males in the village were required to attend or face fines. The court served multiple purposes. It enforced the lord's rights, ensuring obligations were met and fees were paid. It maintained social order by adjudicating disputes before they escalated into violence. And it generated revenue through fines levied for every offense. Minor infractions, late payments of fees, failing to maintain drainage ditches, letting animals stray, might result in fines of a few pence. More serious offenses brought heavier penalties. The court operated under customary law, traditions specific to each manor, recorded in court rolls that documented proceedings. Punishments for serfs were often harsh. Fines were the most common penalty, paid in coin or kind, hitting poor families hard. Public humiliation served as another tool. The stocks and pillory were standard features of medieval villages. Offenders were locked in these devices, often in the market square or outside the church, exposed to public mockery, pelted with refuse, forced to endure hours or days of discomfort and shame. This punishment served dual purposes: the immediate suffering and the lasting damage to reputation. More serious crimes led to corporal punishment. Flogging for theft or assault was common. In extreme cases, mutilation might be ordered. A thief might lose a hand, a slanderer might have their tongue pierced or cut. These brutal penalties seem shocking to us, but were considered appropriate deterrents. They marked the criminal permanently, warning others of their past and making it difficult for them to reoffend or escape their history. Capital punishment existed for the most serious crimes: murder, arson, repeated theft. Hanging was the standard method of execution. Serfs accused of felonies faced trial in higher courts, the 100 Court or the King's Court, where punishments were even more severe. But conviction rates were actually quite low, around 10 to 20%, partly because proving guilt was difficult, and partly because juries were often sympathetic to neighbors. Trial by ordeal had been used in earlier centuries to determine guilt. The accused might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar and walk several paces, then have their hand bandaged for 3 days. If the wound showed signs of healing when inspected, they were innocent, if not, guilty. Or they might be bound and thrown into water. Sinking proved innocence, floating proved guilt. These ordeals operated under the belief that God would intervene to protect the innocent. The church administered them with great ceremony, supervised by priests who blessed the water or iron. But in 1215, the Pope forbade church participation in ordeals, forcing a shift to trial by jury, where 12 local men heard evidence and rendered verdicts. Serfs could be beaten by the lord or his agents, within limits. A lord could not kill a serf without consequences, as that would be murder, but disciplinary violence was acceptable. Bailiffs and stewards used physical intimidation to ensure compliance. The line between legitimate discipline and abuse was vague and often crossed. Serfs had almost no recourse if mistreated. They couldn't take their lord to court. He controlled the court. They couldn't appeal to royal justice except in the most extreme cases. Essentially, they were at the mercy of whoever held power over them. Despite these restrictions, escape from serfdom was possible, though never easy. Several paths existed. The most famous was flight to a town. Medieval towns were growing centers of commerce and craft production, always needing labor. If a serf could reach a town and remain there undetected for a year and a day, legal tradition held that he became free. This was the origin of the saying, "Town air makes free." However, the reality was more complicated. Lords pursued fugitive serfs aggressively, sending agents to towns to identify and reclaim runaways. Manorial court rolls document many cases of serfs being dragged back after attempting escape. Still, some succeeded. A young serf with skills, perhaps a carpenter or smith, might slip away during a pilgrimage or market trip and vanish into urban crowds. Towns offered anonymity that villages lacked. If he could find work and keep his head down, he might avoid detection long enough to claim freedom. But this meant abandoning everything: family, friends, community, the security of knowing where your next meal came from. It was a desperate gamble that failed more often than it succeeded. Another path was through prosperity. Some serfs, through luck, skill, or hard work, accumulated enough wealth to purchase their freedom. The lord might agree to manumission in exchange for a substantial payment. This happened rarely, requiring years of saving and a lord willing to accept the transaction, but it occurred often enough to remain a possibility. More commonly, prosperous serfs might negotiate to commute their labor services into money payments, gaining de facto, if not legal, freedom. The church offered another route. A serf with religious vocation might join a monastery or nunnery. This required the lord's permission and sometimes a payment. But once accepted into a religious house, the person's status changed. They were no longer bound to the manor, though they were bound to their religious order. Some families encouraged younger sons or daughters to take religious vows, both for spiritual reasons and to reduce the number of mouths to feed. Military service occasionally provided opportunities. When kings needed soldiers for wars, Serfs who volunteered might gain freedom or at least temporary relief from obligations. This was never a guaranteed path and carried obvious risks, but desperate men took desperate chances. Some serfs improved their position through skill and initiative without achieving legal freedom. A serf who learned a craft, brewing or blacksmithing or carpentry, could generate income beyond agricultural labor. A serf who cleared new land, draining marshes or cutting forests to create fields, might negotiate favorable terms for holding that land. Entrepreneurial peasants existed, buying and selling at markets, accumulating animals and goods, becoming employers of poorer neighbors. These prosperous villains remained legally unfree, but enjoyed living standards approaching those of minor gentry. Serfdom didn't last forever. By the end of the 14th century, it was weakening dramatically in England, though it persisted in other parts of Europe for centuries longer. Several factors contributed to its decline. The Black Death, the devastating pandemic that struck England in 1348, was the single most important catalyst for change. The plague killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population in just a few years. Villages were depopulated, entire families died. Fields went unplowed for lack of workers. This demographic catastrophe shifted the balance of power between lords and peasants. Suddenly, labor was scarce and valuable. Surviving serfs found themselves in demand. Lords competed for workers, offering better terms, lower rents, commuted labor services, higher wages for hired labor. Serfs who had been bound to the land discovered they could negotiate. If one lord refused reasonable terms, workers might slip away to another estate offering better conditions. The chronic labor shortage forced lords to make concessions they'd never have considered before the plague. Simultaneously, the English economy was monetizing. The 14th and 15th centuries saw increased use of coinage, growth of markets, and expansion of trade. These changes made it easier for peasants to sell surplus produce for cash, to pay rents in money rather than labor service, to accumulate savings. Money created flexibility and opportunity that the old labor service system had suppressed. Social unrest accelerated the process. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, though ultimately suppressed, revealed the depth of rural anger and discontent. Rebels demanded the end of serfdom, the abolition of oppressive fees, and the execution of corrupt officials. Though the revolt failed and its leaders were executed, it frightened the ruling class. Authorities realized that pushing too hard risked provoking more uprisings. Gradual reform seemed safer than maintaining an increasingly unstable system. Economic changes also mattered. Landlords discovered that collecting money rents from free tenants was often more profitable than managing domain agriculture with serf labor. Direct farming required supervision, risk, and capital investment in tools and animals. Leasing land to tenants and collecting cash rents was simpler and more predictable. Many lords shifted to this model, freeing their serfs and converting to rental arrangements. By 1500, serfdom had largely disappeared from England, though it took longer in some remote regions. The transformation was neither quick nor uniform. Some areas saw serfs gaining freedom in the late 1400s, while others maintained feudal obligations well into the 1600s. But the overall trajectory was clear. The system that had defined rural life for half a millennium was dissolving, replaced by wage labor and tenant farming arrangements that gave rural workers more freedom, if not necessarily better living standards. So what was it truly like to be a serf in medieval England? The answer resists simple characterization. It was not the absolute misery of chattel slavery, but neither was it a pastoral idyll. Life was constrained, physically demanding, and offered little upward mobility. Yet it also provided stability, community, and a framework of mutual obligations that gave meaning and structure to existence. The modern imagination often reduces medieval serfs to faceless masses, interchangeable drudges toiling in anonymous suffering. But they were individuals with personalities, aspirations, and agency within their limited circumstances. Court records reveal their voices, serfs arguing property boundaries, defending their rights under manorial custom, pursuing neighbors for debts, complaining about abusive officials. They weren't passive victims, but people navigating a difficult system as best they could. The relationship between lord and serf was complex, not simply exploitation. Yes, lords extracted labor and fees, but they also provided real services. The lord's court adjudicated disputes, preventing the blood feuds that plagued societies without functional justice systems. The lord theoretically protected his tenants from outside threats, though this protection became less meaningful as royal authority expanded. The lord maintained infrastructure, mills, roads, bridges, market facilities. These weren't acts of charity, but reflected the lord's self-interest in maintaining productive estates. Still, they created a system that, however unfair, functioned and sustained millions of people across centuries. The seasonal rhythm of agricultural life structured existence in ways alien to us. Summer meant endless labor, but also warmth, light, and relative plenty. Winter brought rest from field work, but also cold, darkness, and the gnawing fear that food stores might not last until spring. The church calendar provided regular breaks, Sundays and numerous holy days when work ceased. Medieval community ties were simultaneously oppressive and supportive. Everyone knowing your business meant no privacy, but it also meant you were never truly alone. Widows and orphans weren't abandoned, but taken in by relatives or neighbors. The sick you're cared for, at least within families. Festivals and celebrations brought genuine joy. Harvest homes when the crop was safely gathered, Christmas feasts, Easter celebrations, weddings, and church ales where the community gathered to drink and socialize. These moments of communal happiness punctuated the monotony and hardship. Religious faith permeated everything. The church taught that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next, that social hierarchy was divinely ordained, that patience and obedience were virtues. This ideology certainly served the interests of those in power, but it also gave serfs a framework for understanding their situation and a hope that transcended earthly injustice. The promise of heaven, where the last would be first and the suffering would be comforted, sustained people through incredible hardship. Yet we shouldn't romanticize. Hunger was real and recurring. Famines struck with terrible regularity, and when they did, people starved. Disease was constant. Dysentery, influenza, tuberculosis, smallpox, measles. Medical treatment was primitive and often counterproductive. Life expectancy was perhaps 30 to 35 years, dragged down by high infant mortality, but also reflecting that many adults died in their 40s or 50s, worn out by labor and disease. Violence, both casual and organized, was more common than in modern developed societies. Justice was arbitrary and could be brutal. The system was fundamentally unjust, based on inherited status rather than merit, designed to extract labor from the many for the benefit of the few. Serfs were denied basic freedoms we take for granted: to live where they chose, marry whom they loved, pursue the occupation they preferred, keep the fruits of their labor. These restrictions were real and consequential, limiting human potential and causing real suffering. Yet within this unfair system, people created lives worth living. They loved and were loved. They took pride in their work, their skills, their families. They formed friendships, told stories, sang songs, played games. They found meaning in religious devotion, in seasonal rituals, in the bonds of community. They endured, adapted, and sometimes resisted. The story of medieval serfs is ultimately a human story, one of resilience and dignity in difficult circumstances, of ordinary people navigating an extraordinary world, vastly different from our own, yet connected to us by the fundamental experiences of being human. Understanding their lives helps us appreciate both how far we've come and how fragile progress can be. The freedoms we enjoy, the rights we claim, were won slowly and painfully across generations. They're the legacy of those medieval serfs who fled to towns, who negotiated better terms, who revolted when pushed too far, who gradually, incrementally, expanded the boundaries of what was possible for ordinary people. Their struggle to improve their circumstances, constrained though they were, reminds us that every age contains people pushing against injustice, seeking better lives for themselves and their children, creating the slow, difficult progress that shapes history. If you found this exploration of medieval serf life fascinating and want to learn more about the hidden stories of history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these forgotten voices back to life and exploring the realities of the past. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into history. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.